Hello and welcome to Tapas Pretzels, the adorsys podcast. Let's dive into today's episode. Hello and welcome, you three, David, Tim, and also David. Nice to see you again, actually. So how are you? How's your API context as a CEO? How's it going? Because you were also at our podcast, I think, half a year ago, right?
It was the beginning of the year, I think, because we met in Paris and then we did a podcast. And that was API Days last year. So I'm just looking forward to see if I can come out to Paris this year. I've just been trying to fly less because just flying's horrible.
It's better than come running or swimming. So.
That is true. That is true. And I can't exactly take a Zeppelin or a boat from here to Europe. So it's we've had a very. I'm in Seattle.
Okay. You're also in Seattle again. So you have in the morning. Is it in the morning?
It's 7 o'clock in the morning.
Okay, 7 o'clock in the morning.
Podcast, I would say.
Yeah, great time. So I have my coffee. So.
Yes.
Perfect. But that's not the only thing, because you were here. As I said, David O'Neill is the COO of APIContext, COO. And you've said something that a current report APIContext had released. So what is it about? I think it's a really interesting report. So can you tell me about it?
Sure. So we... historically, our platform, we've focused on performance, and a lot of our other reports have been on latency and availability of APIs. This one, we've got some new functionality focused on governance, which was the topic of our last podcast, I think. And we've now got the ability to analyze results against specifications. And as we have a directory of several hundred public APIs from big providers, we thought it would be fascinating to compare the APIs that we are monitoring for the directory and verifying they're available with their open API specification. And as we started digging into it, we realized there's some very interesting information here, because what we were able to codify is the degree of drift between the specification and the delivered API. And we've put that together in a report that's available on our website from the homepage. And the way we did it was we looked at, first of all, whether the provider had a public specification. And in about 40% of cases, they just didn't. There was no official defined public specification. So a lot of API providers just don't put one out there. And I'm going to get into trouble with...
We're talking here about big names usually, aren't
we? We are talking about big names. We're talking about banks. We're talking about IT providers. We're talking about companies that we use for certain critical services where the only open API description, I have to remember to keep saying that, otherwise Eric Wilde will appear magically, Eric Wilde, and shout at me. Yeah. And... so one of our suppliers doesn't provide an open API specification. And what we found when we went looking was there is a specification, it's very out of date, and somebody who used their service wrote it for them. And that's the case in about, I think it's 30% of the specifications 15% of the specifications out there, when they are available, are actually unofficial. Some third party wrote it to put it out there, and often they just quickly put one together. And what we identified was there's a lot of lag between people setting up API descriptions and whether they maintain them or not. And it's something like 30% of the open API descriptions we found haven't been updated since 2021.
Yeah. And what you just said keeps thinking me, pushed me thinking. So there have been people walking through the valley of depression of not having a documented API. So they started documenting it by themselves, because they found it so annoying that they're providing it back to the community that they don't have to walk the same way again.
Yes, and I think we should give a shout out to Kin Lane for a lot of it is Kin Lane's work. We found an awful lot that Kin had created to try and, I think, push people into doing specifications about how important they were as part of his original work on JSON schema and APIs.json, but they were not picked up. And I think what concerned us the most was the lack of defined specifications in some cases. And what we did then is, once we found the specification or not, we uploaded it into our analysis tool, which takes the output from our synthetic monitoring and compares that output to the expected JSON schema and validates whether what we are getting back from the API is what we were expecting. And we found there was significant drift there as well, that in 25% of cases, we were finding that every endpoint we checked was no longer matching the specification that was published. And we've spoken to a number of companies about that, and it's pretty obvious when you think about it why it happens. People specify, so everyone starts with good intentions. Everyone designs something well. You plan it, you design it, you put it out there. It's great. But then you're only ever a few hot fixes or a few changes away from the specification no longer matching the documentation. And then the drift starts to happen. And I think we're in an interesting space in the industry because there are new tools coming out to continuously update the specification. Microsoft and TypeSpec is designed to do that. But we also found drift in Microsoft specifications where, in theory, the published OpenAPI description should always match the APIs because the OpenAPI description is from the document APIs. But we also found that the Microsoft Graph OpenAPI description is 27 megabytes, and it's the entire, all 28,000 potential endpoints in the Microsoft Graph in one giant file. And that, I'll give a shout out to our platform. We were able to import it, but it did make actually validating against anything quite hard. So we see a lot of, the other thing we saw a lot of, which I think is interesting for a governance perspective, is the documented APIs in the developer portal on the website were not the APIs that were available. That in the case of some of our customers, the customers actually only worried about the older versions of the APIs. And one of the things we started to assume was a lot of companies, they might have new APIs for developers, but they're underpinned by the same API. They're underpinned by an older version. And it becomes then a governance question of keeping up to date on your specifications and actually keeping track of what you have spotted, what you identified. And then the final piece of the analysis we did was, what are the common failure patterns we see where we see a mismatch? And very often it was the API returning something that people didn't expect to return, or hadn't documented it would return. And we'd see the use of the null pointer a lot in functional API calls, but in the documentation, the specification assumed that you would never see the null pointer. So we see this particularly in one example we have is from a foreign exchange API where it should always return a list of currencies, and it should always return the currency that the transactions were in. And very frequently, the currencies field was completely empty. It was never returned. So the API itself expects there to be a EUR, GDP, USD, but actually a null field came back and there's nothing in there. And we saw that on shipping APIs and a whole bunch of others where it expected certain codes to come back and they just didn't. And
I can already see like how many hours have been invested by business analysts to understand the existing API documentation, matching it to the internal processes and requirements, spending hours, months, and years on it, and then implementing something on the test environment, and then they bring it to production. Then they're like, suddenly some strange things occur, and like this, I see already people like hot fixing, hot patching, and much stress, and the people and the management, the developers, everyone is super stressed because of this documentation is not fitting reality. That gap.
And then time will go by, and then maybe a new release will happen, and for the first few weeks, everything will be great, and then it will drift again. And I think we what we came to realize, and it's one of the reasons we've done the work we have at APIContext, is to give those analysts and product managers the tools to actually see in production what that drift is. And we're seeing uses for this, particularly in regulated sectors, so particularly finance in Europe with PSD3 coming, in UK open banking, Australian open banking. They are getting fined for non-compliances against schemas, but more importantly, the data that comes back from the API call must be correct. And what we're seeing is there's another opportunity for drift. If you say you have, so this is a real life example from some banks in multiple countries. If you say the interest rate on a mortgage is 4.8%, and the mortgage rate you are presenting in the API is 5.6 or 3.2, that's something that the regulator can fine you for. Because if someone pulls that information and says, oh, the interest rate is this, but it's not the interest rate because the interest rate has changed, that is actually that's a financial services non-compliance. That's the thing that your national regulator will say, well, no, you're not allowed to do that. It's like having incorrect pricing in your supermarket on the shelf, or an incorrect sticker. They can hold you to a different number or raise a compliance issue. And one of the things we've been building into our product is, and we're launching this a little later in the year, we're in beta with customers now, is actually allowing people to set business rules and verify that the content coming back from their APIs is what they expected. Because what we're finding, and I think we were slightly naive, we just assumed that large companies would have a source of truth for their data, that they would pull the data for the website and their glossy brochures and their legal documents and everything from the same source and put it into the API and put it into the website and put it into the documents. And we found out that that was very naive, because these are banks and large companies where the data is contained somewhere on a spreadsheet and then it's passed out to each of the departments and they have to update things. But they were finding, to Tim's point of analysts were having to sit down and just manually verify that the things coming back from the APIs were accurate. And that's not a scalable thing to do. So API drift that we were looking at, it encompasses not just the specification, it's also, is the data in the API correct? Are you getting null fields where you expect it to actually show a tax rate or a currency? And then is it, how bad is that problem? And is it changing over time? And could you prove it? And I think what's happening is people say, oh my goodness, we've had a complaint about you. And then suddenly they have to put business analysts literally looking through piles of JSON and then validating that JSON against the numbers they expect. And anybody who's sat trying to find an error in a JSON file will know that that is not something you want to try and do against numbers in a spreadsheet.
And David, I have a question in this. How are you dealing with semantics? No, because double checking the documentation could be quite straightforward. You have description, you can have the documentation. This is a description field. This is useless, But if in the description, I mention in the description because probably it's the most easier way to see things, right? So in the description, put something that is it's under how the consumer interprets and understands the meaning. How can you deal with that? I mean, we are in the data era, but all we know that semantics are key. How are you dealing with semantics in documentation?
So we're working off the open API. So we're using the same code that we use for identifying personal identifying information. We realized that we could use it in the same way for looking at descriptions. So our platform makes synthetic calls. We get the data back from the synthetic call. So we have the full, we have the results of actual functional API calls, typically that we're making to production accounts in real scenarios. And then what we're doing is, on an endpoint by endpoint basis, we're validating that what comes. So the first step is we validate what comes back does it match what we expect for that endpoint? And we do an endpoint by endpoint, essentially schema validation check against them. And so that's the first set of checks. And we've created algorithms to do that. Relatively deterministic. We did look at using AI for it, which is a whole another topic, and we came to the conclusion that for a business critical use like that, you can't rely on AI. It just has too high a persistent failure rate on the results, of the order of 5 to 8% on average, we found, and that's just too high for false positives to bother. And then the next piece that we're working on now is business logic rules. So identifying the things that ought to be in there, and what we will be providing is essentially a JSON format, or actually probably a YAML format, which will say, these are the things I expect to see in the results. So how many results, if you request 10 results, do you get 10 results? What should be in the results? So the kind of checks that we're being asked by customers to provide are, we believe we have 1,237 bank branches, and they are in these locations. And can you validate that from the API, we return the correct number of branches and the correct locations and the correct phone number and the correct number of ATMs, for example? Or these are our interest rates. Can you check our product interest rates match what we have? And we've built algorithms that will then do those those matching checks of, are these results contained in the return JSON? Yes or no? And then we'll flag up schema violations and tell people where in the results we're seeing the schema violations or the data violations. But again, yeah, it's been an interesting exercise, because the other piece we found, and you'll hear this, we use the importer from the team at APImatic, but you'll hear from them as well, and Ali talks about this a lot, is that there's a huge amount of drift between people thinking they have a viable OpenAPI description and actually having one that can be machine read and works. And I think we've still got a lot of work to do as an industry for actually producing documentation that's fit for purpose. I have high hopes that things like the new Arazo workflows description coming from the OpenAPI, what are we calling it now? OpenAPI initiative, will help that, where you'll be able to describe sequences of API calls rather than just individual endpoints. Because I think one of the things that we also observed when we were setting up a lot of the test cases is it can be, even with a well-documented API, it can be extremely hard to work out what an API is meant to do from the documentation. Not just from, we had one we were setting up recently, or we were working on a customer with, and it was one of the rarest examples I've ever had. It was really easy to get an OAuth authentication token, and then really nearly impossible to get their APIs to work. And they'd left out a critical piece of information about how you use the token from the documentation. So, and one word can make a huge difference to whether an API call works. So
that's true. Secret or not secret?
Well, this one was, yeah, they had inserted you had to use an extra word in the authentication token that wasn't actually documented, but we spent ages looking at it going, why isn't that working? And eventually someone said, oh, why don't you insert that and see if it works? And documentation shouldn't be around trying random things to see if they work until they do. But unfortunately, most documentation appears to be, or a lot of documentation does.
I can imagine. I mean, I see the negative impact, or the impact that happens when you don't document the APIs. But I'm a person that mostly try to look on the positive side of things. So did you turn around like, hey, we're going to release a top 10 ranking of companies that providing the most accurate APIs, which you can rely on, that you can, if you want to build a reliable business, these are the API partners you should bet on. Did you do that?
It is in the report. I won't give anything away, but GitHub have a huge detailed specification, and it is absolutely 100% accurate that we found. So they every endpoint that they have matched what they said it was, as far as we could tell. So I think there are some providers who take it very seriously, but I won't name and shame, but there are, say, some identity providers who don't even offer a description. And if you think about the importance of getting your identity services provider working and how critical it is to your, particularly if you're in SaaS like we are, it was a bit surprising to us that they didn't have that. That was not available, shall we say?
Are those identity providers all mainly in the press for like having some security issues? Just not calling out any names, but
yeah, I think they are. I'm to be honest, though, I'm not sure. I'm not sure that the security issues have much to do with the documentation. I guess you could say, is it a symptom that they are not necessarily on top of their governance in a way that would help them identify security issues? I wouldn't like to speculate on that. I do think if you're offering a complex identity management solution with single sign-on that's available via API, the least you could do is provide a valid, up-to-date open API description for your APIs.
But I have one question about it. Why do you think so many companies are struggling to document or have a good API specification? What are maybe the reasons for it? Because, as you said, it's a lot.
I do not know, and I would love companies to contact me and actually start a dialogue and talk about this. I think it touches on what we discussed in our last podcast around governance. I think it's not something that people want to do, and it's not seen as it's seen as a nice to have, not a must have. And I think there's conceptually there needs to be a shift in attitudes on that people just it's something that people will get around to and then they never get around to it. And I think Kin Lane has talked about this a lot in some of his storytelling in his podcast, in his blog, about how people view governance issues as a nice to have but not actually essential. And I think in a lot of industries it should be becoming essential. It should be something people think about more. And I think the other problem is it's just teams are rushed, and to a point Tim made earlier, they're busy working towards what management's telling them to do. They're getting fixes out, they're updating their services, and the documentation is always a lagging indicator of that. I think one of the findings that the members of the Open API initiative were pleased with, though, is at least most people are using more than 50%, pushing 60% of the industry is using version 3.xx of the Open API specification. So they are on the current top versions. But we also found a lot of regulated APIs, which were created maybe 3-4 years ago and haven't been updated, are still on Swagger 2. And all of the paperwork, all of the documentation is for Swagger 2. And that's onto the regulator to update. And I think regulators, if something's working, they don't want to touch it. So I think there are a lot of pressures with why things don't move. But I think it's mostly in large companies, institutional inertia and not focusing enough on the quality. And I think good shout out to GitHub for actually having something that is up to date, is kept up to date, and matches exactly what they deliver. Not that they're immune from outages, as we found out the other week, but
what do you think about the use of AI to do, for example, an update of the format of the API to transition from Swagger to us, or to create the documentation?
So I'm still an AI skeptic on some of these business critical features, as I think you know, David, because we exchange messages on LinkedIn regularly.
I know. That's why I'm asking.
I'm not as negative as Kin Lane, who is really quite negative on the topic. But when we were building the first version of our rules engine for our API context platform, please try it. Sorry, bit of a plug. We thought we would use AI, and we thought AI was the solution. And we thought AI would be useful for onboarding users and defining journeys and specifications. And what we found was 85% of the time it was pretty good, and it would generate something that was right. But we couldn't, no matter how hard we tried, we couldn't get that last 10-15% to work. It would just come up with something that looked like it should work, but it was semantically wrong. And I think I don't think that's been solved by LLMs yet, and I'm not 100% sure if that kind of technical problem will be solved directly by LLMs. I think we see it as well in code generation. A good software engineer can become a great software engineer using AI copilots. It's very good if you know what you're doing. If you don't know what you're doing or are very unskilled, you can get yourself into a lot of trouble because you won't know when it's gone wrong. And that's the delta that I don't think we couldn't see a way of getting around. I can see some uses for some of the business logic things, but what we conclude is we'd have to build our own model. We would have to manage our own model, and we would have to control it very rigorously. And as we started doing the work on that, we realized that it was because a lot of the things that go wrong that our customers worried about are purely deterministic. It was easier to build a deterministic model that says, are there 15 items? Can you see 15 items? There's a famous, they took it from Orwell, but it was in Star Trek with Jean-Luc Picard seeing as being tortured and seeing a certain number of lights. And eventually he's persuaded that he's seeing a different number of lights. LLMs are a bit like that they can just decide, no, there are 5 items here when actually there really are only 4. And I haven't seen a way. We haven't got an easy way around that without doing as much work as building an algorithm yet.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that, well, first, if you don't know what you are doing, don't use AI, because AI helps you to do things, but you need to know what you are doing, because you have to review what AI gives you. If you don't have any criteria, it's best. I think it's better not to use AI. And then I agree with you. If the API is very complex, AI will, I wouldn't say fail, but it won't get you the results you are expecting. Probably for simple APIs, it works. I think LLMs work, for example, to give you test data. If you feed the LLM with the OS with the specification, and then ask, okay, I want to test these post methods and provide the endpoint, they will give you, obviously, if the specification is very well built, they will provide good data for testing. Or you can ask the GPT or Gemini, okay, I want to make a test with Postman, code me the collection, and it works, or it works most of the cases. But you have to be very, very, very critical with the results AI is giving you. I think that there is a lot of space for it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, isn't it the nature by LLMs? LLMs are probabilistic methods, basically applying statistics. It's probabilistic, so it's not all accurate. Like as David said, like there's deterministic solutions and there are probabilistic solutions, and there's something in between that, neurosymbolic. But like I would say, like you can use LLMs for like the first 60-70%, like most accurate. The bigger it gets, the less accurate it will be, and then you have to do it by either like run it through a loop or like really apply deterministic algorithms on top of it. Like, but I like the view how you did it, and is the outcome of your report, like again, do you plan to highlight those companies? Because if I would be a business owner and rely and have governance behind me, pushing me with fines or confronting me with fines because I'm exposing wrong APIs in a regulated environment, I would definitely bet on API providers that I can rely on. And this report will show out the top most reliable API vendors for specific industries. I think this is going to be a huge impact. Could have like that would encourage all other people like to stay on top of this ranking, because if you not systematically approach this, why should you spend money on systematically approaching the API quality? Because it doesn't help you, it helps others, not you. That's what's in for me.
We may well go down that route. We've shied away from pointing fingers at people because we found people get upset with us. So we don't want to be discussing things with their attorneys, shall we say. But I think ultimately particularly when people are being fined, I think that it is critical that when you're checking something is right, it needs to be done deterministically. It needs to be done 100% right, and you cannot do it on a probabilistic method. For just checking if the spec kind of aligns, we may be able to do more with AI as time goes on. But I think the problem there is, at the moment, by the time we'd finished doing the work to try and get an AI to do it reliably, we realized we may as well have just written a deterministic algorithm, and then we went and wrote deterministic algorithms. And we based it on the same ones we had that detect private information leaking. And that's still something we are working on and refining before we launch that to the public. Looking at what looks like an an email, what looks like a social security number or a identity number, what looks like a date of birth, etc. So we've still got a lot of work to do on that, and we may well put a section in it. So we will likely add to our next generation product is a baseline security score and a baseline documentation index. So to give people an indication of, GitHub has a 9.8 quality score, gets an A for their documentation quality and an A for their security, whereas random identity provider might get an 8.6 for quality, but it gets a C or D for documentation because it doesn't have any, and a B for security. So that's what we're looking at, how to present that data. We know there are other providers out there who've been going with different numbers for different things, and we're still not sure you can overwhelm people with too many numbers that they can't really follow, and it's currently not something that we can actually calculate. You can't calculate a percentage for this. That's the problem. It's because there is still a degree of you've got to make a determination of whether what the key things are. You can't say, oh, this specification is 95% accurate or 87% accurate. All we can do is, unfortunately, look at what is coming back on this endpoint. Does it match the schema or does it not match the schema? And that's binary, unfortunately. It either does or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, then it's failing. And then that becomes so we've had to spend a lot of time thinking about how we present that data to users. And actually, it's been it's been an interesting exercise for us, particularly as we look to these regulated APIs, where in theory there's no wiggle room. And actually, we found some providers are 100% accurate and some are not. The other thing that we're still working on how to track, and this wasn't part of this paper, but we are working on that, is data freshness. And it's when was the last time this data was updated? So if you have APIs that provide you with information, we've done some initial work on this, particularly with public information APIs, where we'll be looking at the last date the API thinks it was updated, first comparing the hashes of the returned content with previous hashes, and then finding out that some enterprising engineering teams have found they'll change the date of last update, but not actually change the data. Now, that might be valid. It might be that the data hasn't changed, but they did check it, or they might just change it to today's date every day. And we have a suspicion, so we say, because we know for a fact that some of the data should have changed, that some of the providers that we've looked at initially have not been updating anything. But in order to fool people into thinking they're updating it, they changed the date on which the API was last updated. So I think and actually that comes into that's something that AI might be quite good at, just doing that kind of pattern matching over time. But it's definitely, it comes into the governance question. I think product managers and analysts are somewhat left out of these decisions, that engineering teams and ops teams focus on delivering solutions, and they're not very worried about what's happening back in the design and management side. And then drift happens, and there aren't very many ways for the analysts, apart from doing manual spot checks and physically looking at things, to do that. Except for now, we can do that automatically and then alert people when that drift occurs. But at the start of everything should be a valid specification that should be kept up to date, and you should have one. And the fact that 30 or 40% of the providers out there don't actually provide any kind of open API specification, I think or description, sorry, Eric, is really problematic. And I think that was the big takeaway for me from the paper, that we've had documentation standards for APIs for quite a long time, almost as long as the APIs themselves have been around. And a large number of the providers are still not doing that work. And I think that's it's something that Kin Lane has talked about pretty much as long as I've known him. And he's still right. It's still a piece of work that everybody ought to do more. And it does worry me that companies can have APIs they expect third parties to use, but they do not provide documentation on those APIs and how they work. And that just seems like that's setting people up for failure or setting yourselves up for complexity. And I think maybe that's because a lot of companies went down the SDK route or trying to obfuscate the API from the developer. But I think that doesn't remove the obligation to actually document what it is you're providing.
So thank you, David. There were interesting results, and what I would say low API specification quality or bad documentation can actually have, so what kind of impact. And if you're interested in the paper, then we will link it into our description so you can read it by yourself. And thank you, David, that you were here. Also, Tim and the other David, thank you that you were also here. And if you want to follow us on LinkedIn or YouTube, you can do it. And we will see us for the next podcast.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.